Right. Hello and welcome, everybody, to the FAA Transport Canada webinar on Revision 3 of our IPA Implementation Procedures for Airworthiness. My name is Dave Higginbotham. I work in the FAA's Aircraft Certification Service in the International Office, where I'm the Senior Representative for the Americas and ICAO. Quick thank you to the FAA's Office of Communication for helping us put this together. Couldn't have done it without you, so thanks very much. Today's format, if you're participating by Zoom, you'll see your microphones are muted. And for those watching via YouTube, we invite you to submit questions via the link that should be provided in the YouTube window. What we're going to do is try to cover those questions at the end. We'll look for common themes with those questions and do our best to answer as many as we can after the PowerPoint presentation. We also intend to provide a written answer to all of your questions. We're compiling those on a spreadsheet as you ask them, and we'll be providing those answers as quickly as possible following our presentation. Couple of details about the slide formats that you're going to see, different colors used. The blue text that you see in the slides is going to be new language in the IPA. The black text is either existing language from the IPA or a summary of lengthier portions of the IPA. This session is being recorded, so you'll be able to watch it via the YouTube channel on FAA's website, and we will also post the PowerPoint presentation shortly and share the link with the attendees. And before we get started, I just want to acknowledge the strong partnership that we have with Transport Canada and recognize the level of collaboration it took to reach this point with the new IPA revision, and really appreciate them joining us to present this webinar today. So thanks again for joining, everybody. I'd like to hand it over to Danielle Swaim for our next portion.
Yes, thank you, Dave. Good morning and good afternoon, all. So this will be the FAA TCCA implementation procedures for airworthiness revision 3 outreach session. We have a great number of folks tuning in, so thank you for spending this time with us. With that, we'll get started with some quick introductions. My name is Danielle Swaim. I am the FAA Aircraft Certification Foreign Affairs Specialist in Air 42 with responsibilities for Canada. I manage the IPA and our overall relationship with TCCA from the FAA side. And now if we could introduce our presenters today. Steve?
Thank you, Danielle. Hi everybody, my name is Steve Steiskal. I'm an engineer with the Aircraft Certification Service, FAA, Air 41 International Programs Branch. I'm located in Seattle and I've been with the FAA for almost 12 years now. I've been involved with a number of these outreach presentations, so I may be familiar to some of you, and I thank you for returning to get this information. We hope you find it valuable. I'd like to take this moment again to thank Eric and Greg from Transport Canada and their team for all the hard work they put into this and collaborating with us to put this presentation together. It was quite an effort, and again, thanks so much to those guys for contributing. Eric?
Thank you, Daniel, Steve, and Dave. Good afternoon, good morning to everyone. Transport Canada is very pleased to join the FAA today, and we would like to welcome and thank you all for joining. My name is Eric Lucas. I'm the manager for international arrangements in the standards branch for Transport Canada Civil Aviation. I join you today from the National Capital Region here in Ottawa, and we acknowledge we are on traditional unceded Algonquin Anishinaabe territory. Joining me today for the presentation is Mr. Greg Ucharek from our region, and joining us for the panel is our certification policy expert, Carlos Peguero. So over to you, Greg and Carlos. Thank you.
Hi, thank you, Eric. And yes, good day, everybody. My name is Greg Ucharek. I'm with the National Aircraft Certification Branch of Transport Canada. Been working in that role for approximately 20 years now, and really enjoying the work and the opportunities to work on initiatives like this IPA 3. I am presently one of 7 regional managers across the country, and my office is located at the International Airport in Calgary, Alberta, which I would also like to acknowledge is on the land of Treaty 7 territory and the traditional lands of the Blackfoot, Stoney, and Tsuut'ina First Nations. And it's my pleasure to be here today. Over to you, Carlos.
Good day, everyone. I work alongside Eric in Aircraft Certification Standards Division. I'm a senior engineer there and responsible for policy update and guidance material for foreign validation, among other things. So I look forward to answering your questions today. Back to you, Danielle.
Thank you all. As Dave mentioned, we will be having a Q&A session at the end. So I'd like to introduce our panelists as well. Pong Lee from our Air 40 branch, as well as Mazdak Hobby. If you'd like to give some introductions.
Hello, everyone. My name is Pong Lee. I'm the manager of the International Affairs branch in the International Office of the FAA's Aircraft Certification Service.
Hello, everyone. My name is Mazdak Hobby. I'm one of the senior reps alongside with David, and here to lend a hand. Thank you.
Thank you. And then from our new 730 validations branch, we have Anthony Gallo.
Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Anthony Gallo. I'm the manager of the new International Validation branch that we stood up last year in the Certification and Airworthiness Division, Air 700 in the FAA. As you know, we're now being responsible for all the inbound validations, and we're going to also support the outbound validations later this year that will be will be with the ACOs that are currently with them. And on board with me is Mr. Kenny Kalea. Kenny, could you introduce yourself, please?
Certainly. My name is Kenny Kalea. I'm an aviation safety specialist in, as Anthony mentioned, in the FAA's International Validation branch. I just joined the branch in April. For the 14 years prior to that, I've acted as both a inbound as well as an outbound program manager for the FAA.
Thank you all. So with that, I think we'll get started. If we could load up the presentation, please, and we can jump right into slide 2. I'm going to be turning off my camera so that way I can focus on the speaking notes. So the purpose of this session is to cover only changes between revision 2 and revision 3. We will not be discussing the entire IPA. Also, there will be a Q&A session at the end of the presentation. I know most folks are all very curious and have a lot of really interesting questions, so please feel free to submit those via the Q&A form that should be in the chat on YouTube. And then lastly, we will also provide some contact information if anyone has additional questions. So on to slide 3, please. For this presentation, at the top of the slide, you'll see a title or summary, and then where space permits, with the changes from Rev 2 to Rev 3 will be presented in blue text, similar to that of tracked change function in a Word document. So the blue text will be the new language and the black text will be existing text. As this format makes the presentation extremely text heavy, where space does not provide on the slides, we will simply contain an overall summary of the changes to that section. Other changes not presented today are not considered substantive. So next slide, please. Now jumping right into the IPA itself, in section 1, we have added a new paragraph under 1.8 to emphasize involvement of the FAA's Office of Environment and Energy, AEE, on any U.S. environmental issues. Next slide, please. In paragraph 1.11, we have changed terminology to accommodate the use of the appropriate legal term, entry into force, versus the term used in IPA Rev 2, effective date. So revision 3 of the IPA also introduces a 90-day delay of the entry into force to allow the FAA time to prepare its respective certification offices and also give you folks in industry a chance to understand the changes and hopefully learn more, which is what we're all doing today during this outreach session. So mark your calendars. The IPA will enter into force on July 25th, 2021. Next slide, please. So now we'll go through the IPA definitions in paragraph 1.12. Here's a list of new definitions that we've added to revision 3. These additional definitions are editorial in nature, used to support a common or single interpretation in the context of the IPA. These new definitions are also common terminologies used in many bilateral agreements. The only one we really want to highlight here is the validation program term, which was added to clarify the scope of a validation activity under the IPA. Essentially, the validation program is everything from the initial application all the way to issuance. So we'll touch on that more later when we review section 3, but for now, if we could go to the next slide, please. In this slide, we've captured the definitions that were revised or edited for better clarification or to align the definition with the FAA regulations. As you'll see in the blue text here, the for the FAA and voluntary, these definitions were revised because there is no TCCA equivalent. We've also revised the term work plan to emphasize that this is approved by the validating authority's management. So next slide, please. Lastly, with section 1, we did delete one definition, the definition of finding. We chose to do this because we wanted to assume the dictionary meaning. And next. So with section 2, we're just highlighting this one change, which is on note 3 on table 1 to clarify what equivalent document means in TCCA's context. This refers to the treatment of TCCA's grandfathered approvals, which we will be explaining in more detail again later on in the presentation. So now if we could move to the next slide, please, and I'll hand it over to my TCCA colleagues to address the changes in section 3.
Thank you, Daniel. So section 3 talks about design approval procedures. Greg and I will explain all the changes that we've done to section 3. We'll tag team. I'll explain the first half and then at some point turn it over to Greg. So first up is 3.2, acceptance principle. This is the provision in the IPA where we speak of the different design approvals that are automatically accepted by both the FAA and Transport Canada. For the lead-in paragraph in 3.2.1, it's an administrative change. We simply said that, subject to any exception described in 3.3 or 3.2, the following are automatically accepted. So that's just an administrative reference to something that is already there. With regard to item 3.2.1.1, it became known to us that the status of a minor change under IPA revision 2 wasn't very clear. So for revision 3, we made it very explicit that minor changes are automatically accepted under the IPA. Now, at the bottom of the slide, you will see item 3.2.12. Now, this is something new in IPA Rev 3, in that this is a Transport Canada only provision where we have now enshrined in the IPA our longstanding policy of accepting FAA-approved design changes on eligible state of design, US state of design products, parts 23 and 27. And I'd like to key on the word eligible, which I will explain on the next few slides. Next slide, please. So something that is already in section 3, but was at a different section. Under the acceptance principle that applies to all design approvals that are automatically accepted, there used to be a provision in IPA Rev 2 that was only applicable to TSO, and that was the ability for a validating authority to suspend recognition or acceptance of a TSO. And as you know, TSOs are automatically accepted. So for revision 3, we acknowledge that this should not just be confined to TSO, as the principle should also apply for all design approvals that are automatically accepted under the IPA. So what you're seeing here as a new paragraph 3.2.2 is really lifted from the TSO and relocated to state that this now applies to all design approvals that are automatically accepted. So the principle behind this is that under the old IPA Rev 2, there was no recourse for the validating authority to reject or suspend recognition of an automatically accepted design approval. So what this provision does is that if and when there is an unresolved airworthiness issue or concern with regard to a design approval that's automatically accepted, this provision allows for the VA and the CA to discuss that issue. As an example, the VA and the CA may differ on views of what an unsafe condition could be that could exist or may exist in a design approval. Or perhaps there are differences in compliance expectations for a design approval. So if that is the case, then we expect our technical experts or SMEs to engage in a discussion to find some ways of resolving the airworthiness concern by the validating authority. So this provision is intended to be applied on a case-by-case basis, and the conflict resolution is actually consistent with what is already stated in the IPA, which is we encourage resolution at the technical level as much as possible. And if that is not, if there is still any impasse, then we would like the issue to be progressively elevated to the next level of management. When is it necessary to invoke this provision? If the situation does not see any resolution, then this IPA provision was intended to be exercised at the management level rather than at the specialist or SME level. So when we refer to the management level, it will be the same IPA executives who had authority to enter us into an IPA agreement, or their designated authorized designee to make that decision. So again, the whole purpose of this is just to simply make the suspension provision applicable to all automatically approved design approvals. Next slide, please. A new feature that or a new provision that we are adding the IPA is what I mentioned earlier, is to enshrine a long-standing policy that we have been automatically accepting FAA STCs for US State of Design Parts 23 and 27. There's a bit of a background on this one because prior to 1996, Transport Canada had a policy of accepting a lot of FAA type certificates for the purpose of issuing a Canadian standard certificate of airworthiness. So these FAA type certificates became our basis for granting the C of A, and there was no equivalent TCCA type certificates that were required or issued. And so these FAA type certificates that were recognized and accepted prior to 1996 basically correspond to what we consider as a grandfathered design approval. And along with that same principle, consequently, all FAA approved design changes on these grandfathered approvals were also automatically accepted without the issuance of an equivalent TCCA design change. I made a mark on 1996 because 1996 is when we introduced what we now have as the Canadian Aviation Regulations, which from that point on required that Transport Canada issue a type certificate or an STC for both domestic and imported products. But the policy for grandfathered products continued. And so since that time, we have been exercising that. And now with IPA Rev 3, we have decided to enshrine that decades-old policy. So I will explain a bit what the grandfathered US State Design Parts 23 and 27 products are in the next slide, please. So essentially, the products that are eligible, the FASTCs that are eligible are for Parts 23 and 27 aircraft. So you will see on the slide under paragraph A, we're essentially talking all Part 23 aircraft with the exception of commuter category. So all Part 23 aircraft that were certified on the basis of 14 CFR Part 23 or to earlier equivalent regulations. When it comes to Part 27, we will automatically accept all FASTCs for normal category rotorcraft that are grandfathered, certified on the basis of Part 27 or to earlier equivalent regulations. Now, the last paragraph at the bottom of the slide is simply a qualifier that if a Part 23 or Part 27 product is not grandfathered, then the FASTCs intended for those products need to be validated by Transport Canada, and subsequently we will issue an equivalent Transport Canada STC. Next slide, please. So IPA Rev 3, we have provided in Appendix B a link to the Transport Canada website where you can actually verify if the product you have in mind is grandfathered. Now, I should warn you that the list has over 1,000 aircraft listed there, and that's because we grandfathered a range of products from Parts 23, 25, 27, and 29. But for the purpose of the IPA, where we consider grandfathered Parts 23 and 27, only Parts 23 and 27 products that are listed on our website are the ones eligible. So if you have an FASTC and you want to see if it's eligible for automatic acceptance, simply click on the link and you should be able to identify if your product is there. If your product is there, then they are automatically accepted for Parts 23 and 27. If it's not, then you need to follow the IPA, and an application would need to be submitted through the FAA. Next slide, please. So I mentioned earlier in the introduction that this suspension provision was lifted from what used to be under IPA Rev through as only exclusive for TSO. And so what we are showing you here is that that paragraph under IPA Rev through is now deleted. So, and it's been relocated now to section 3.2, shown earlier. Next slide, please. Another provision that we amended is on 3.3.4.7. As you know, TSOs are automatically accepted and there is no validation required. We recognize that for the validating authority, there are some TSOs where we may need some data from both the certifying authority and the TSO holder to help the validating authority approve the installation of the aircraft. As an example, I can think of the auxiliary power unit where you will need installation interface requirements on the aircraft side, or perhaps installation of an avionics suite consisting of multiple TSO approvals. So in this particular case, to assist the validating authority to grant installation approval, the validating authority should be able to request data that is necessary to establish compliance at the installation level. We should note, however, that the data request is not intended for the validating authority to conduct validation of this TSO design approval itself. So in some ways, it is limited only for the data you need for installation. The next slide, please. So this change in item 3.3.5.3 is really not a substantive change, but it is a clarification. As you know, the IPA carries a provision where we may avail the services of an FAA DER or ODA when it comes to data approval. And the condition is that we can do so provided there is prior agreement with the FAA. So paragraph C is intended to clarify what exactly the role of an FAA DER or ODA is. And what we're saying here is that if Transport Canada is granting an approval as the certificating authority under the Canadian Aviation Regulations, the status of a DER or a ODA data approval with regard to that certification activity has no standing or are not recognized. And the reason for that is in Canada, there is only one level of approval granted for a product or a design change. And that approval is granted at the type certificate level or at the STC. We do not have a system where you can have designee or delegate approval or a collection of designee approval to become a justification to issue an STC. All of those substantiation are considered under the perspective of findings of compliance. So what we're trying to clarify in paragraph C is that if we are the certificating authority and exercising state of design approvals under the Canadian Aviation Regulations, our level of approval is only at the approval document level. We may involve the DER or an ODA from a findings of compliance perspective to assist us, but the data approval will remain only with Transport Canada. So with that, I'd like to turn over the presentation now to my colleague, Greg. Greg, please. Thank you.
Thanks, Eric. Okay, so section 3.4. This is the section on our validation principles, and you can see from the text here, there's no blue items, so we're not talking about specific items at this point. But recognize that the section was largely involved editorial changes. We intended to better explain elements of the validation process and also standardizing some key language elements. So for example, the term validation program versus say a validation activity or a familiarization is emphasized throughout. And there was a number of changes. We'll get into some more details as the slides progress, but ultimately the validation principles continue to recognize a risk-based threshold for VA involvement. So the provisions that you saw in Rev 2, like the streamlined process or the technical validation process, those remain largely unchanged. Although some of the contents of them have been re-emphasized here. For example, a work plan. The work plan is identified as a certification tool in a technical validation process. And although the IPA is somewhat prescriptive in the necessity for a work plan, we did want to work some language to really put some scalability to it, and also emphasize that based on the I guess the risk-based principles, that the focus of the validating authority is really intended to be on the non-basic elements. So we'll talk a little bit more about that as we continue. And again, at the end of a validation program, the end result will be either an approval or an acceptance issued by the authorities. So next slide, please. Okay, yeah. So this is a new provision in the classification criteria for validation of type certificates, and very similar to what Eric spoke about, the Part 23, Part 27 normal category. This is a unilateral TCCA provision, and it really is intended to encompass what was a very long-standing practice for the validation of type certificates for U.S. state of design reciprocating engines and U.S. state of design propellers. Now, the initial application for a new type certificate is classified as non-basic per the IPA. So this is a bit of an exception in that we can classify, or we now recognize for Transport Canada, we will classify these types of applications for type certificates as basic. So again, it's not new in terms of our practices, but it is new in terms of a provision in the agreement. And I guess one thing just to clarify here is that there are some exceptions where a type certificate for a reciprocating engine may include, or a propeller, pardon me, may include an exemption, a special condition, or equivalent level of safety. Then those would be traditional or classic non-basic triggers, and then they would not be eligible for the basic classification. So, and also, I guess to clarify for propellers, we're speaking about both fixed and variable pitch propellers as part of this provision. So if we have a turbine engine or a recip engine or a propeller that is not eligible for streamlined, then they will go through the technical validation as a non-basic. Next slide, please. And I guess really in the same vein, since we applied this risk-based policy to the initial type certificate for reciprocating engines and propellers, we had to address the scenario of design changes to those same products. So in 3522, you'll see language here that pretty much does the same thing. It allows for streamlined validation of these changes. Again, noting the same exceptions that we talked about previously, whether there's exemptions, special conditions, or ELOS findings, then they would be classified as non-basic. So again, we just simply apply the same long-standing practice to design changes as we had done for the type certificates. Next slide, please. Classification. So 3522, classification criteria for design changes and non-basic. There was a lot of work put into this one paragraph. You'll remember from revision 2, the criteria for a non-basic change was a little bit more ambiguous when it came to limitations. And I think the language said something to the effect of changes affecting certified flight envelope, limitations or operating conditions, etc. It led to a large degree of interpretation and misinterpretation on a change that affected limitations. And the effort put in here was to really clarify that we're not talking, when we're talking about limitations, our intention was to capture operating limitations for the aircraft. So the language here is much more clear, and we're recognizing that we're not speaking about airworthiness limitations that are contained within an ICA as a non-basic trigger. But I guess in the same vein, we also need to recognize that a design change that includes airworthiness limitations as part of that particular package may trip another non-basic trigger in some of the other provisions. So for example, a change in Canada that affects FAR Part 26 in the US, well, that's considered an ATC. So as an additional technical condition, that is a non-basic change. And again, there may be airworthiness limitations, or very likely would be airworthiness limitations associated with that. So that design change would be classified as non-basic. Likewise, there's another provision under a VI, which allows some discretion of the certifying authority to make the decision. And Again, just depending on the nature of the design change, if it's unusual, if it's really non-routine from what we normally see in day-to-day sustaining, the certifying authority can make the determination that it would be non-basic and provide that to the other authority for validation. I think we want to emphasize that this isn't new criteria on limitations, but really just a clarification of what was originally intended for this section. Towards the latter part of the paragraph, you'll see some blue text there as well, related to special purpose operations in restricted category. And this was also a little bit confusing in Rev 2, where the intention for a non-basic trigger is where the design change causes a restricted category classification. So, for example, if we were doing a design change to convert a commuter category or a transport category aircraft for forestry operations as an air tanker, for example, that would move it into a restricted category, and that would be considered non-basic. As opposed to where some of the confusion lied in Rev 2 was perhaps a change to a restricted category aircraft, and that wasn't the intent. So, for example, if you were installing a piece of conventional equipment, a GPS or an antenna on an air tractor, which is a restricted category aircraft, the virtue of the design change would not trigger a non-basic classification in that case. So I hope the language here is a little more clear in that respect. Next slide, please. There was an additional non-basic criteria added, and Danielle spoke a little bit to this in the definitions at the beginning of the presentation. We added provision 5, provision V, for changes that require new or revised compliance determinations for environmental aspects. And this was added really to accommodate the involvement of the FAA's Office for Environment and Energy. As that's where the authority resides to determine compliance with U.S. environmental requirements. So this was a provision we had to add to accommodate that office and their involvement. Next slide, please. Lots of words on this slide, this is language changes around the application process. So in this particular paragraph, what we really wanted to do here was clarify what constitutes submission of an application package for validation purposes, and specifically make it clear that there's 3 items considered part of an application package. First off, the transmittal cover letter from the certifying authority to the validating authority, which contains the request and various other elements, but also a validation application form completed by the applicant and the design approval holder, as well as the design approval holder data package. And the minimum technical data package hasn't changed, so we'll still see certification plans, approved manuals, those types of things as part of the basic data package, and that hasn't changed. But we really wanted to recognize and emphasize that when an application is made, these 3 elements are expected at the onset. So that's the change that you see here. Next slide, please. Oh yeah, this was another one. So IPA Rev 2. Sorry, let me back up a little bit. 3.5.4, acknowledgement of an application. And from the black text here, you can see that this is quite a bit of a generalized slide. But what this really wanted to accommodate was some recourse for the validating authority to check the basic, non-basic classification that was submitted with the application. IPA Rev 2 was quite prescriptive and absolute in the acceptance of the CA classification, and really had no recourse mechanism for the validating authority. This caused a great deal of difficulty for practitioners on both sides of the border in dealing with applications that were misclassified, some obviously and some not obviously. So IPA Rev 3 introduced the opportunity for technical consultation between the assigned project managers, really in an attempt to fully understand the rationale for the classification. So with this mechanism in part incorporated into the IPA, this will allow the CA to have a second look. If the VA feels there's an incorrect classification, they can engage their counterpart and review the classification. At which point in time, you know, if the CA determines that, yeah, the VA is correct, oftentimes there's things like ATCs that are maybe not obvious or not obviously implicated as an affected area and may be overlooked. Those can be captured and the CA would simply reclassify their application and we would go forward from there. If, however, the CA has taken the time to discuss the classification and review it again with the VA, and they're fairly confident that the classification was correct initially, they can you know, maintain that disposition and maintain the rendering of basic or non-basic, whatever it was originally. The outcome of all of this consultation is expected to be a document, a documented exchange between the two parties, and that documented conclusion will you know, remain with the validation file, but also shared with the IPA custodians. Largely for future maintenance efforts if we're still seeing some classification difficulties in the future. So anyways, that was a big change, and I think it will be helpful for both parties. Next slide, please. Okay, the technical validation process. So again, there's lots of words here, and I mentioned earlier about the necessity for a work plan, and in 3.5.6, as part of the validation process, we introduced some flexibility for the validating authority to actually waive the formality of a work plan. And there may be cases where the application package contains sufficient data and compliance documentation that will allow the VA to make a determination on that basis alone. So subsequently, we can conclude the validation effort at that point without bringing in another certification document like a work plan. So this was flexibility introduced into IPA 3, and we think that'll be very helpful going forward as well. Next slide, please. Technical familiarization 3.561. Now, changes made to this paragraph are primarily to generalize the intended scope of the technical familiarization, and based largely on best practices that most of us are familiar with today. For example, familiarization is intended for the VA to gain some familiarity and knowledge of the type design, for both continued operational safety as well as for establishing a valid VA certification basis. So that's a familiarization activity. Also, identification and review of certification issues raised by the CA become an important part of that process. This is the I guess the element of the validation program that really allows the VA to determine their intended level of involvement for the purposes of getting a work plan fleshed out, and is an important part of that. This is also an opportunity where the validating authority will make a decision if they need to actually fly the aircraft as part of the validation program. So again, technical familiarization, although not new, we've tried to generalize the intent of the familiarization aspect of the overall program. Next slide, please. So this section, again, back to the work plan, it is really, the changes here were intended to clarify the scope of the VA work plan. It was rewritten to really put some more comprehensive guidance around developing a work plan. And what it does is it differentiates the development and the management approval from the development and implementation as was framed in IPA Rev 2. So it's basically I guess it facilitates the change to the work plan, or the evolution of the work plan, and put some emphasis on things like scalability. So although the IPA may be prescriptive in the fact that a work plan is necessary, it recognizes that it should be scalable and commensurate with the scope and complexity of the design change being validated. So a simple design change that's non-basic, well, we would expect the work plan to be very focused in that respect as well. This is also the section where there's guidance provided on when a VA may waive the work plan entirely. So it speaks to the fact that the VA level of involvement is, again, intended to really be focused on the non-basic criteria. And that's consistent with the risk-based approach to the IPA in general. I spoke a little bit about flight testing earlier, and we recognize that flight testing is a work plan element, and will be expected to be fleshed out in the work planning activity here as well. And ultimately, in the end, the work plan is approved by the validating authority's management. So this just allows for some checks and balances on adherence to the principles of the bilateral agreement overall. Next slide, please. So from development of the work plan comes implementation of the work plan. And again, this is fairly similar to what we saw in revision 2. However, there was another provision added specifically for flight testing. And this provision provides some clarification and really some differentiation on flight test activities with respect to either familiarization or type design examination. So perhaps at the initial onset and in developing the work plan, flight test validation flights may have been identified in the work plan. However, this also allows, at the discretion of the VA, they may elect to conduct familiarization flights in lieu of, and it's important to differentiate the difference here. Familiarization flights are really intended as a more of an education tool for the validating authorities' flight crews to exercise the aircraft and understand the platform and how it operates, as opposed to type design examination, which is flying for compliance purposes. So flying for compliance purposes means we're going out to touch corners of the envelope or doing a dive test for vibration, those kinds of things. So it was important to differentiate the two, because as the last bullet you'll see here, we recognize that familiarization flights should not prevent the validating authority from issuing an approval, because it's not a type design examination activity. So that was an important delineation. It's recognized that the validating authority can conduct the familiarization flights post-approval, and there's expectations on the CA and the design approval holder to meet their commitments in allowing the VA access to the platform for those familiarization flights at a later date. Next slide, please. Staying with the implementation of the work plan section, there was another paragraph added to paragraph D related to approved manuals. The approval of approved manuals, as noted in the IPA, is the responsibility of the certifying authority. However, where there's a standalone change to any of those approved manuals, it's recognized that these constitute a change to the approved type design, and therefore they will be subject to the same basic and non-basic criteria that any design change would, and then processed accordingly. So that expectation and language was added to 3564 just for that purpose. And I believe that's it for section 3. So that's it for me. I'll hand the mic over to Steve and continue with section 4 and continuing airworthiness.
Thank you, Craig. Again, I'm Steve Steiskal, FAA, and I'll be wrapping up the remaining sections. So we'll jump into section 4, continuing airworthiness. There's a change to 4.3 that affects Transport Canada. Previous provision stated that for FAA AMOCs of general applicability when issued for U.S. state of design products, they could either be accepted as is or an equivalent Transport Canada AMOC approval is issued on the basis of the FAA's. The new paragraph clarifies that where an FAA-AD is adopted in Canada, any AMOC of general applicability for that AD is automatically accepted with no further action required on the part of Transport Canada. Next slide, please. Sections 5 and 6 don't have any substantial changes in those. So now we'll jump ahead to section 7, export airworthiness approval procedures, and a change to section 7.5 that speaks to new modification and replacement parts. The phrase or equivalent to an authorized release certificate is introduced to recognize the FAA Part 21 amendment, allowing the production approval holder to issue authorized release documents for export using FAA Form 8130-3. The term safe for installation found in Rev 2 is changed to read safe for operation. It was previously 3 requirements in Rev 2. The wording eligible for installation was problematic since the -3 form does not certify eligibility for installation. So the previous paragraph stating eligibility for installation was removed in Rev 3. Next slide. Moving on to section 8, technical assistance between authorities. An addition was made to section 813, which adds a new provision for the CA to cooperate in upholding VA requirements for foreign design approval holders, which extends beyond design validation activities. This provision explicitly addresses the need for the CA to assist in support of VA regulations to a design approval holder under the jurisdiction of the CA. The wording then directs the reader to section 8.8, which I'll discuss in the next slide. As further explained, the VA requirements for foreign design approval holders, as a VA has regulatory requirements requiring a foreign design approval holder to fulfill certain administrative procedures and technical actions intended for the continued operational safety of imported products. For example, design approval holder is required to receive and analyze service difficulty reports or take mandatory action when requested by the authority. Where the regulatory requirements of the CA and the VA are the same or equivalent, the VA will rely on the CA's oversight and enforcement of that requirement on behalf of the VA. Where the requirements are unilateral for the VA, the CA and VA shall consult each other on the appropriate action to be taken in order for the affected design approval holder to respond or comply with the applicable VA requirement. Next, please. We conclude with the changes to the appendices. Names, physical addresses, and Appendix A have been updated. On the FAA side, we've had office name and designation changes due to our transformation and refinement. On the Transport Canada side, there is now one mailbox for STC applications as well. In Appendix B, list of reference documents, we've added FAA Order 8110.52 type and post type validation procedures, as well as the 8110.54, the ICAs, as well as the U.S. eligible aircraft list, the Transport Canada web link, which Eric addressed in his previous slides. The Appendix C has a list of special arrangements. It adds an FAA Transport Canada management plan on the change to the type design for the Bombardier Challenger 350 Rockwell Collins ProLine Fusion Avionics update, and on the Rockwell Collins STC with that program, as well as shared surveillance of FAA production approval holders and Transport Canada approved manufacturers. Appendix E cancels by Rev 3 the management plan for the Bombardier Aerospace BD-100 Continental Aircraft program and the Transport Canada FAA approved flight manual revision procedure that was dated 2011. So that concludes the sections and appendices section of this program and outreach session. Next slide, please. We've listed our contact info for the speakers today. Eric, Greg, Danielle, and myself are listed on there. On behalf of the FAA, again, for industry, we encourage you to reach out with your questions to the applicable program manager at first. If there's policy questions or you're having trouble getting questions answered, then it's appropriate to reach out to the Air 40 side, but we always say to work with your local personnel first and foremost. So that, Danielle, I'm going to turn the mic back over to you.
Thank you, Steve, and thank you, Eric and Greg, for presenting. During the presentation, we've been receiving and reviewing your questions behind the scenes here. As I mentioned at the beginning, we have a great group of panelists who are familiar with the IPA and able to assist us with answering these questions. One of those members who we didn't get a chance to introduce, but I'd like to now, is Ray Reinhardt. Ray, if you want to give a quick introduction.
Hi, thank you, Danielle. I'm the section manager in the New York ACO, overseeing all the Transport Canada TC and STC work for Part 25 and also all the STCs, you know, that basic and non-basic. And Fabio Batista is working with me as a program manager and also Ballroom Rambridge. So if you have any questions, work with Fabio and Ram, and if not, just drop me a line. Nice to meet everyone.
Excellent. Thank you, Ray. And now we'll turn it over to Dave as our moderator, who can help us field some of your questions and see if we can get some answers.
All right, thanks, Danielle. And we've gotten a couple of good questions, well, many good questions, I won't say a couple, through our link, so appreciate everyone sending those in. I think, heads up, Eric, I think this first one is best sent to you. It addresses section 3.2.2, the new safeguard clause where the VA can now suspend automatic acceptance. So the question is, how does that section work, and how does it interface with the existing section 1.8 about interpretations and resolutions of conflicts when it's invoked?
Thank you. That's a good question. So the new suspension provision works exactly the same way as what we have envisioned in 1.8, which is we would like to see some resolution at the lowest level possible at the technical SME level. And if there is no resolution, to progressively elevate it to the next level of management and go on. And if there is clearly no resolution, then eventually the issue is brought up to the executives who are authorized to sign the IPA, and they will in turn make that decision. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Eric. Let's see, this next one, it's got a little bit of an intro, so bear with me as I read through that. Greg, I think this one is good for you, and there's two questions actually. So Greg, maybe you can handle the first one, and then Ray, the second one. So for large transport aircraft, can the FAA and Transport Canada please clarify if standalone major revisions to the airworthiness limitations section, which is an approved manual as defined in the IPA, which do not cause a TCDS revision and do not invoke any of the non-basic criteria in that section, are they considered basic and therefore automatically accepted per section 3311? And the second part of that is, does the FAA still need to re-sign the FAA approval page For example, introduction of phase-ins or changes in task types from general visual inspection to detailed visual inspection for some airworthiness limitations, or even changes in formatting. So that's a lot. So Greg, if you could start, please.
Sure, that is a lot. And as I was listening to the question, it almost sounds like it answers itself, actually. It was pretty well framed with pointers to the provisions in the agreement. Actually, I don't have in front of me right at the minute, so I can't cite the paragraphs off the top of my head, but I think this goes back to my last slide, honestly, where I was speaking to standalone changes to approved manuals, and the question is correct. An airworthiness limitation section of an ICA is an approved manual, and I think what I tried to emphasize in the slide was that changes to these manuals do need to be assessed as either basic or non-basic. And I think the questionnaire recognizes that there is the section 3.3.1 of the bilateral agreement that really directs us on what happens with those changes. So if they are classified as basic and they don't cause a change to the parent documents, then those would be accepted without application. On the other hand, if there is a non-basic classification assigned, then yeah, certainly they become validation material, and an application is required. So again, I think the question actually pretty much answered itself with the pointers to the IPA 3. I don't know how much more I would add to that. I think maybe I'll hand it over to Ray for the second half.
Yeah, Ray, and I'll repeat that second part. It's does the FAA still need to re-sign the FAA approval page? And maybe that's part of what Greg just described, depending on the significance of the revision.
Yeah, so if the AWL section is being changed and it is classified as basic, then there is no submittal, there's no application. In general terms, the FAA does not approve the AWL section. You won't see a FAA signature on it. But for non-basic changes to the type design, we do give an approval letter for the non-basic change. And that is the approval, FAA approval, which is actually allowing TCCA to approve it on our behalf. And that's in the letter. So for non-basic changes, there is a letter, FAA approval letter, that goes to Transport Canada for them to accept it on our behalf. But for non-basics, there is no approval letter. And we do not sign the AWL section, only Transport Canada signs that.
Okay, thank you, Ray. Let's see, next question. And Greg, this might come back to you. I'll say Greg and maybe Anthony. Can the FAA and Transport Canada please clarify and confirm the non-basic classification criteria, i.e., does it specifically pertain to the aircraft flight manual? If removing an AFM limitation falls within the criteria of expanding the certificated flight envelope, operating limitation, etc., can the implementation of a limitation, which would technically restrict the flight envelope, be considered as a basic change?
Yeah, this is a really good question. And one of the things we recognized is that the IPA can't provide examples of every type of change possible. So I think we gotta step back and look at the validation principles and the risk thresholds that we're expecting to be validated. So if this was the provision, in fact, that we spoke specifically to in the slide deck, and the non-basic classification is about the design change. And I also recognize that an AFM is approved manual. If there happens to be a standalone change to that manual, then it would have to be classified as basic or non-basic as well. So expanding the envelope, there's various ways that can happen. For example, I think about expanding the weight, altitude, temperature charts for a helicopter, for a rotorcraft. Now that's a standalone change to the AFM, and that is certainly expanding the envelope. So that would be classified as a non-basic change. On the other hand, let's talk about installing some form of external modification on a helicopter. Oftentimes, we need to restrict the V&E of the rotorcraft, so that becomes a change in the limitation. However, the fact that we've changed the limitation, it's contracting the envelope and would therefore be considered basic. So, we have to look at the change as a whole, and I think that's about all I can say to this question. I don't know if anybody else would like to weigh in on it, but that's where I would leave it.
Well, if I may, Greg,
Please.
If you are contracting and you are making a limitation more restrictive, there's another part of the IPA then will kick in, because if we want to restrict what all the aircrafts that are operating out there and make a limitation more restrictive, then that would be done through an airworthiness directive.
Okay.
So
thank you for that. I guess in my mind, I'm as a regional engineer, I'm dealing with STCs. So STC is a standalone, and thank you for that clarification. That was excellent. So I agree. Airworthiness directives is under Section 4, and that may be another venue to accommodate the change.
Right. So that change which is more restrictive. It may be basic under the definition in Section 3, but under Section 4, because it is more restrictive, it has to be done through mandatory action.
Thank you.
All right, thank you both. This one might be quick and easy. What is the cost and estimated time to acceptance for a Transport Canada STC?
That is a great question. We don't have a time, I guess a level of service specification for STCs. However, I think historically we tend to validate anywhere from 10 to 30 days from time of the project onset. So that's our typical performance. However, that being said, there's when we start talking about some non-basic applications that are more technically complex, and or if they're the application package is incomplete, we'll see timelines exceed 50 days often. So it is variable, and we don't have a specific target for that level of service. And with respect to the cost, presently there are no fees associated with validation activities. Our regulatory schedule is CAR 104, and that contains that's our fee structure. Now, as a regulation, I mean, it is subject to change from time to time, so I can't speak to the future, but present day, there is no fee for a validation program.
Okay, thanks, Greg. We have a couple here that came in a few minutes apart concerning RPAS. So maybe Eric, maybe you can help us out with this one. Now it has moved, sorry. First is a short question. Have you addressed RPA and UAS in the IPA? And then the second one is longer. Concerns a particular company, Drone Delivery Canada, is in the process of planning multiple aircraft certification projects for its remotely piloted aircraft UAS, and has requested that FAA and TCCA consider coordinating the certification process according to the bilateral agreement. Will this update to the agreement include provisions for inclusion of RPAS? And if not, could we provide some rationale as to why not?
Yeah, thank you, Dave. I'll take that question. So the answer to the first question is the RPAS UAS in the IPA, and the answer is not yet. And the reason it's not yet is because for folks who are familiar with the validation improvement roadmap between Transport Canada and the FAA, we have identified the issue of RPAS and UAS. And the issue there is that because our two authorities are still working on the certification process, I believe in the FAA you have a type certification process depending on the weight of the UAS. On the Canadian side, I believe our certification is actually embedded or integrated in the operational approval. So the airworthiness aspect is not a standalone certification, but part of the operational approval. So what we have identified in the roadmap is given the certification process may be different as of this time, we have entered into the roadmap as one of the targeted goals is how to facilitate the import-export of the RPAS UAS under the IPA. And so that will be something that we will look at for the next revision. As of today, I believe our offices for the RPAS and UAS are currently exploring that roadmap goal as to how the IPA can play a role. Thank you.
Thanks, Eric. And I'd also like to add that our legal counsel's office has evaluated our IPAs that where the scope includes aircraft, and have determined that RPAS or unmanned aircraft systems are considered aircraft. So for those IPAs that do include aircraft within the scope, RPAS would be eligible for movement between the bilateral partners. But as you described, Eric, we still have some work to do on how we would actually facilitate that.
Thank you, Dave. I think that's a good start, recognizing drones or UAS or RPAS is actually qualified on the aircraft. So we do have one foot in the IPA. We just need to sort out the other details.
Yep.
Thank you.
And I would say as well that that conversation has been kind of reinvigorated now that we've signed IPA Rev 3. So this is definitely on our radar with more to come.
Yep. I think I can answer this next one. Question is, it would be useful to include an index for IPA revisions, because in the absence of an index, one needs to do a back-to-back comparison of revisions using commercial software. And all I can say is I agree. We have worked with AGC, our legal counsel's office, to even to incorporate a small revision into an existing IPA by inserting PDF pages where appropriate, and our legal counsel's office does not want us to do that. So this questioner is correct. The best way to find the specific changes between one version and the next is to convert the PDFs into a word processing program and then compare version 1 to version 2. And we apologize for that, but that's simply how we're limited according to our legal counsel's office. So the next one has to do with issue papers and concern papers. Greg, this might be for you. Historically, TCCA has used issue papers and concern papers for validations. IPA Rev 3 only defines issue papers. Are concern papers officially not going to be used from this point forward?
That's an interesting question, and it's actually more policy related, which I'm not sure. I recognize that. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
I can respond to that.
Eric.
So initially, we had included concern paper in the IPA, and then after some soul searching, we said that we are not going to include concern paper. So moving forward, on the IPA will only recognize issue paper. And even within Transport Canada, we are now changing our policy to not use concern paper. Part of that driver is, for some of you are aware, that the concern paper was a subject of discussion at the Parliamentary Committee on Transportation with regard to the 737 MAX. And so the way the concern paper and the issue papers are being handled, they're almost synonymous. So to avoid any confusion, there will just be an issue paper. Thank you.
Okay, thank you both for that. Next one has to do with the grandfathering provisions. Eric, I think similar to the question we got yesterday during our authorities only session. Will the grandfather provisions for Part 23 still apply to normal category aircraft certified under 14 CFR Part 23 Amendment 64? And I know you have also recently issued your version of Amendment 64.
Yes, I'd like to call on Carlos to kindly respond to that question. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Eric. Yes, so when this change to the policy was coming up, it was deliberated and consulted through many of our divisions at NEC and standards. This Amendment 64 was one of the triggers, I guess, that was discussed, along with other technologies such as new and novel, and different restrictions in categories, and ultimately, since this is a risk-based approach, and the determination was that Amendment 64 and all other restrictive language such as new or novel was actually taken out. And so at face value, what's in Rev 3 right now in terms of categories and eligibility, that those stand. So including Amendment 64 would actually be applicable to that policy.
Okay, thank you, Carlos. Next one has to do with validation of the 777X. Question is, so the 777X has some significant challenges for certification as stated by the FAA, and I guess this is a reference to statements in international media. So when will it be in service and get a, oh, sorry. So when it, okay, I guess so when it is certificated by the FAA, can we expect immediate approval from Transport Canada?
So this is Kenny Kelly. I can take that question, I believe.
Thanks, Kenny.
So at this point, there have been no identified customers in Canada. So my understanding is that Boeing has not yet made application to Transport Canada for the 777X. Of course, that could change once the aircraft enters service. But at this point, there is my understanding is that there is no activity or planned activity for Canadian validation for the 777X.
Thank you, Kenny. I just got feedback from our folks too that from Transport Canada, we have not received an application yet. So.
Great. Let's see, I think maybe this next one is for Anthony. It starts with, there's clearly a large amount of trust between both authorities. Well, thank you, we agree. We thank you for that assessment. For the classification between basic and non-basic, it is expected that the FAA will step up and provide training and guidance to their employees, designers, and ODA unit members for Canada unique regulations and guidance. For example, the Canadian AC and TP publications. What's the FAA training plan? Can we expect to see a draft guidance document soon? Opinion is this is critical because the applicant and FAA are trusted to know if the STC involves any non-basic triggers, which include the Canadian advisory material. Anthony?
Yes, so so everyone could know that we had a session just like this, the same session yesterday with FAA only and Transport Canada only personnel. And that was very well attended. And we had a lot of good conversation. And so a lot of our specialists got trained on these changes. In fact, there are some of them are on today's broadcast too. So any documentation and everything that's available to the public will be made available to the FAA specialists also. As far as designees or delegated authorities like ODAs, those will be done as part of the ACO's oversight facility of those facilities. So if a facility feels they need some training on that, they should work through their ACO on that request. Now, as the other part of this question is that as part of refinement in Air 700 and refinement of our new Air 730 branch, by the end of the year, we're also looking to have in place resources and a process where we can also provide assistance to the ACOs with outbound validation. So if there are questions from the specialists in the ACOs, we can assist them with parts of the IPA and understanding the IPA, and also assisting with making sure that work plans that are developed by the VA are within the boundaries of the IPA. So they will have our assistance with that later this year.
Great, thanks, Anthony. Let's see. Next question. This might be another easy one. What management person and level of that individual approves the validation work plans at Transport Canada and at the FAA?
So I'll take that one for the FAA. So right now in the 730 branch, International Validation Branch, it is the section managers that are approving those validation work plans. In New York, I believe it's the ACO manager that's approving them, or the delegated section manager on behalf of the ACO manager. I am not 100% sure in the ECO. I believe it might be the section manager, but I'm not 100% sure on that one.
I think, and I can just chime in a little bit from the Transport Canada side. With respect to STCs, it would be the regional managers, such as myself, that would be approving those work plans. Work plans associated with a type certificate would be typically signed by the chief of our projects branch at that level. So hopefully that helps.
Okay, thank you. Let's see. This one has to do with reciprocal acceptance. Does the FAA and TCCA still automatically accept through reciprocal acceptance all TSO articles?
The answer is absolutely yes.
All right. Thanks, Eric. 1 second here. Question about STCs that may be suspended. How would the applicant or STC owner know if Transport Canada has suspended an STC, and what recourse does the applicant have to address that suspension?
So go ahead, Danielle.
I was going to say, I will start, and then I'm sure Eric will fill in anything I've missed. So first of all, this suspension is not done lightly. This is only invoked by the IPA signatories. So that would be Earl Lawrence and then Felix Monnier. So if this is the case, you can rest assured that the applicant is aware. We've been discussing this for quite some time, and through all of our actions, we just cannot find a resolution. So yes, the applicant would definitely be aware, and this is not something that we would take lightly.
Thank you, Danielle. So the question about the recourse is, of course, the recourse is always to come up with a solution that can be mutually agreed between the FAA and Transport Canada. Ultimately, if there's none, then yes, the suspension is something that can be invoked, but that's not something we take very lightly. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, thank you both. Next one concerns where people can look at the new IPA. So is a copy of the new IPA available, and where can one get a copy? Danielle, I think you can share that information.
Yes, so I apologize if there's any confusion on that. The IPAs on the FAA side, at least, are listed on our bilateral listings website. You will currently see IPA Rev 2 along with IPA Rev 3 both posted, because IPA Rev 3 will not enter into force until July 25th. So if anyone has trouble accessing that, please feel free to reach out. I know sometimes if you have saved links, those links can change on occasion. So please reach out and we can assist you.
Yes, and for Transport Canada, it's already uploaded on the Transport Canada website in both official languages. But do note that only the English language is the signed version, but both are provided in the official languages. Thank you.
Okay, great. Next question has to do with basic and non-basic determinations. And Eric, this might, and Greg, this might go to the challenge provision that you discussed earlier. And just noting that we have about 5 more minutes and a few more questions, so hopefully we can get through them. The verbal descriptions provided within the presentation for the trigger between basic and non-basic determination are quite clear. Unfortunately, there have been numerous cases where items have been listed as basic by default when they clearly breach the threshold and need to be considered as non-basic. How would this group of panelists educate the broader community on the correct interpretation of the regulation? I guess rather than regulation, we mean provision of the IPA.
The provision, yeah, of course. So that's an interesting question, and I think time will tell. We started with an idea of publishing an FAQ, a frequently asked questions, as one possible medium. I think we'll have to see how this plays out. The biggest difference between 1 and 2, pardon me, IPA 2 and IPA 3 is, as you mentioned, David, at least IPA 3 now has a recourse mechanism. So when we do bump up against these, we'll have a documented resolution that the IPA committee and the IPA team will have, I guess, a growing library of them. And we'll see where it goes. It's really going to be through sessions like this, like outreach sessions. If we do more in the future as these things come up, that would be a good educational forum. Outside the FAQs, I think that's probably our only recourse that we've even been talking about at this point in time. So
Right.
And I'll leave it there, and maybe Eric, if you want to flesh out anything else.
I think you covered it well. I think to me what's most important is that whenever we get into that challenge function, the documentation of the conclusion of that discussion becomes, like you said, a library, and that will allow us to tweak and fine-tune the policy as we move along from this point forward. Because like we said earlier, it's really hard to provide very specific examples under that category. And so this is a learning process for us. We have a basic understanding of what we want to, but as we move along, we get into this situation. The documentation is very, very important, because that will serve as fodder for revision the next time.
Okay, thank you. We've got 2 questions that are almost identical. I think maybe folks were comparing notes. Has to do with restricting the envelope again, and will that always be basic? So the first one, I'll read them both. Restricting the envelope is not always subject to an AD. Can it still be classified as basic? That's the first one. Second one is non-basic criteria. Restricting the envelope is not always subject to an AD. In these cases, can it be classified as basic?
Yeah, that actually goes back to my response. Again, looking at this with my STC goggles on, we often restrict envelope things like V&E for an external mod, and by all means, that could be considered a basic change. A design change would be basic in that scenario. But again, as Anthony pointed out, if it's a type design change to an existing certified aircraft that requires a contraction, that may be looked at differently from an AD perspective. So,
and I think when it comes to the criteria for non-basic, let's also remember that there is item 6, which is at the CA's discretion to determine that a change is non-basic. So anything that we feel is maybe in that gray area, we could also utilize that item as well.
All right, and then we'll just go with one last question. We got almost all of them, but for those that we missed, we will certainly reach out to the people who submitted those questions to make sure we do provide an answer. Last question for the group, and maybe Eric, this is you. I think you addressed it partially. Is there an article lookup on the Transport Canada website, like was mentioned at the start of the presentation, for engines? Is there one specific to articles, or do you get to that level of detail?
I'm not so sure, and please don't quote me, but I think I have seen one. Now, it may have been on our website, but please understand our website is constantly evolving, and some of the links that you may have found before, you may not be able to locate. So I can get back to you whether there is actually a website for the engine, but at this point in time, I can't confirm there is one.
Okay. Thank you, Eric. And I think we'll stop the questions now. I think there's only 4 that we didn't get to. So as I said, we'll try to provide a written response to the people who submitted those questions. And thanks very much to everybody for your questions. I think it's really helped support the conversation. So I will hand it back over to Danielle.
Yes, thank you, Dave, for moderating, and thank you to all of our presenters and panelists for helping support this event. A huge thank you to our Office of Communications. Hopefully folks didn't have too many technical glitches, and that's all due to their hard work. So thank you, everyone. For those who would like to view this session again, as a refresher, the YouTube link will be available for viewing in the future. So feel free to save that. And please reach out if you have any additional questions. And thank you to our TCCA counterparts for supporting us with this. So,
and we thank you. It's a pleasure to be joining you on this. Thank you.
All right. Everybody have a great rest of your day and a great rest of the week. Take care.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.